The first thing I heard was laughter. Not loud laughter. Not cruel laughter. Just the polite kind people give when they don't want to look rude. But somehow that kind hurts more. The room was glowing with soft golden lights. Waiters moved between groups carrying trays of champagne. Giant screens behind the stage showed my brother's company logo spinning slowly. Tonight was his big night. After 3 years of building his tech startup, Jeff was finally launching it in front of investors, reporters, and some of the most powerful people in the tech world. And somehow, I had convinced myself to come. I stood near the back of the room trying to look proud, trying to ignore the quiet voice in my head reminding me how long it had been since Jeff and I were actually close. Then Jeff raised his glass on stage. "Tonight is special," he said, smiling confidently, "because the people who believed in me are all here." Applause filled the room. Jeff scanned the crowd. Then his eyes landed on me, and his smile changed. "Oh look," he said, pointing directly at me. "Even my sibling came tonight." A few people turned their heads. Jeff chuckled. "You know, the sibling who never quite made it." The room erupted with soft laughter. My chest tightened. For a moment I couldn't breathe. I had come here to support him. After years of distance, after everything that happened between us, I thought tonight might finally be different. Instead, I was the punchline of his joke. Every eye in the room drifted toward me. Some people looked curious. Others looked uncomfortable. I wished the floor would open and swallow me whole. Jeff was already moving on with his speech like nothing had happened. "Anyway," he said smoothly, clicking to the next slide. "Let me show you the technology that's about to change global logistics." The giant screen behind him lit up with bright diagrams and data flows. Applause followed again. But I barely heard it. My ears were ringing. I grabbed a glass of water from a passing tray, just to give my hand something to hold. I kept telling myself to stay calm. Just smile. Just survive the night. But then something strange happened. Across the table near the front row, one of the investors was staring at me. Not casually. Not politely. He was staring like someone trying to remember a face from a dream. He didn't laugh at Jeff's joke. He didn't clap with the others. He just kept looking at me like he was trying to solve a puzzle. A tall man in a dark suit leaned toward him and whispered something. But the investor barely reacted. His eyes never left me. For a second, I wondered if I had spilled something on my shirt. Then Jeff clicked another slide. "Launchflow AI," he said proudly. "Our proprietary system that optimizes global supply chains in real time." The room leaned forward with interest. Investors nodded. Phones came out to record. But the man staring at me suddenly sat up straighter. His expression changed. It wasn't curiosity anymore. It was shock. He leaned forward, squinting at my face as if he had just realized something impossible. My stomach twisted. Why was he looking at me like that? Jeff kept speaking excitedly on stage. "This algorithm reduces delivery time by nearly 40%. The investor suddenly stood up from his chair. The movement was small, but it caught my attention immediately. He walked slowly toward the back of the room. Toward me. Each step felt heavier than the last. People shifted slightly to let him pass. When he finally stopped in front of me, I realized everyone nearby had gone quiet. He studied my face carefully. Not rude. Just intense. Then he spoke in a calm, almost confused voice. "Sorry," he said. "Can I ask you something?" I nodded, unsure what was happening. He tilted his head slightly. "What did you say your name was again?" I told him. The moment the name left my mouth, his eyes widened. He slowly turned his head toward the stage. Toward Jeff. Toward the giant screen displaying the technology that everyone was praising. Then he looked back at me and asked a question that made my heart stop. "Did you ever work on a logistics algorithm about 4 years ago?" The investor looked like he had just seen a ghost. He was a tall man in his 50s with silver hair and sharp eyes. His name tag read Daniel Ross. I had heard Jeff mention him before. Daniel was the lead investor who might put millions into the company. Jeff continued his presentation like nothing had happened. Slides appeared on the screen behind him, showing graphs and delivery routes. The audience clapped at each point. But Daniel wasn't paying attention anymore. His eyes stayed locked on me. During the networking break, he walked straight over to my table. "Excuse me," he said politely. May I speak with you for a moment? I nodded, confused. We stepped aside near a quiet corner of the hall. Daniel studied my face like he was trying to remember something important. Have we met before? He asked. I don't think so, I replied. He rubbed his chin. Then he asked a strange question. Did you ever work on logistics algorithms, about 4 years ago? My heart stopped, because the answer was yes. But I hadn't talked about that work in years. And the technology one built back then had disappeared. 4 years ago, my life looked very different. Back then I was deep in the world of coding and systems design. I worked as a freelance developer, taking small contracts from companies that needed help solving technical problems. Most jobs were simple. But one project changed everything. I started building a supply chain optimization system. It was software that could plan delivery routes faster and smarter than most systems used by shipping companies. I worked on it day and night. The system studied traffic patterns, warehouse locations, and delivery times. Then it adjusted routes in real time. Could save companies millions of dollars. I called the project FlowSync. For months I believed it would change my career. But things didn't end the way I planned. A business partner I trusted tried to claim the project as his own. When the argument turned ugly, the deal collapsed. I was exhausted and angry, so I walked away from the entire tech industry. I never told anyone about FlowSync again, until Daniel spoke the name out loud. Did you call the system FlowSync? My chest tightened. How do you know that name? I asked. Daniel didn't answer my question right away. Instead, he slowly turned his head toward the stage. Jeff had just started the live demonstration part of his presentation. The screen behind him showed a colorful dashboard filled with maps and delivery routes. This, Jeff announced proudly, is our core platform. The name appeared in bold letters. LaunchFlow AI. The audience leaned forward with interest. Jeff explained how the system could analyze thousands of delivery paths in seconds. It could adjust routes instantly when traffic changed or when warehouses ran low on inventory. Investors nodded as he spoke. Daniel quietly whispered beside me, "Look at the interface." I did. The dashboard layout felt strangely familiar. The route visualization panel sat on the left side. The live optimization window appeared on the right. Even the color patterns looked the same. My chest tightened. Daniel finally answered my question. I know the name FlowSync, he said slowly, because this system looks exactly like the one described in an old technical paper I once reviewed. I swallowed hard. Jeff stood proudly on stage. But what he was presenting looked painfully familiar. My mind raced as Jeff continued speaking. He described LaunchFlow AI as a brand new technology that he built with his development team over the past year. The crowd listened carefully, but the more I watched the demo, the more uncomfortable I felt. The routing engine moved data through the system in a way I recognized instantly. The code structure behind the interface had to be similar. Even the way the delivery nodes connected looked like my original design. Daniel noticed my reaction. You recognize it, he said quietly. I'm not sure, I replied. But deep down I knew. This system looked too close to my old project. Daniel folded his arms. Your brother told us he created this platform from scratch, he said. My pulse pounded. Maybe he did, I said quickly. But Daniel shook his head. Technology like this doesn't appear overnight. It takes years of development. I stared at the screen again. Jeff clicked through different panels while explaining the algorithm. Every part of it felt familiar. But I had never shared FlowSync publicly. Except once. A memory surfaced slowly in my mind. 4 years ago, during the worst month of my life, Jeff had let me stay at his apartment. Back then, I was struggling after the failed business deal. I had just ended the partnership that destroyed the FlowSync project. I felt burned out and angry at the tech industry. Jeff offered his couch while I figured things out. For a few weeks, I stayed in his spare room. Most nights I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop open. I kept working on FlowSync, trying to fix problems and improve the routing logic. Jeff watched sometimes while eating dinner. He didn't seem very interested. He ran a small marketing company at the time and talked more about business plans than technology. But my laptop stayed on that kitchen table almost every night. Then one evening we had a huge argument. I don't even remember what started it. Maybe it was stress. Maybe it was pride. I packed my bags and left in the middle of the night. In the rush, I forgot something important. My laptop. Jeff called a few days later and said he would mail it back to me. And eventually a package arrived. I always believed it was the same computer. But now a strange thought crossed my mind. What if it wasn't? Daniel leaned closer and lowered his voice. Did you ever file a patent for FlowSync? He asked. I shook my head. No. The project ended before I reached that stage. He sighed quietly. That's unfortunate. Why? I asked. Daniel glanced toward the stage again. Because Jeff told investors the core architecture was invented last year. My stomach twisted. But if your system existed 4 years ago, he continued, that timeline becomes very interesting. The demo on stage continued. Jeff showed how LaunchFlow AI predicted warehouse shortages and adjusted delivery routes before delays happened. The crowd seemed impressed. But Daniel kept analyzing every slide carefully. I've funded logistics companies for 20 years, he said softly, and I can usually tell when technology has deeper roots than a founder claims. I felt nervous. Maybe it's just a coincidence, I said. Daniel shook his head slowly. Coincidences rarely copy the same design structure. He looked straight at me. If what you're thinking is true, someone might have reused the original framework. The thought made my chest tighten. Because if that was true, someone had copied FlowSync. Jeff finished his presentation to loud applause. People stood up from their chairs while waiters refilled champagne glasses. The excitement in the room grew as investors began discussing possible funding. Jeff stepped down from the stage smiling proudly. Daniel gently tapped my shoulder. I need to show you something, he said. He pulled out his tablet and opened a document. This is part of the development log your brother shared with investors. The screen displayed a timeline of coding milestones. Each entry showed a date and description. Daniel scrolled slowly. According to Jeff, he explained, the first prototype of LaunchFlow AI was created in early 2024. He zoomed into a specific section. Lines of code comments appeared beside timestamps. Take a closer look, he said. I leaned in. At first everything seemed normal. But Daniel pointed at a small detail. These modules were written in a coding style that was popular several years ago, he explained. My heart beat faster. Because I recognized that style. It was the same structure I used when building FlowSync. Daniel continued scrolling. Then he paused on another entry. The timestamps say 2024, he said. But the code design tells a different story. Daniel enlarged the code file on his tablet. Look at the architecture pattern, he said. I studied the screen carefully. The routing engine connected to the warehouse database through a layered API structure. The formatting looked exactly like the modules I once wrote. Daniel tapped another section. Notice how these functions reference older library versions, he explained. Those were common around 2019. My pulse quickened. That's when I built FlowSync, I whispered. Daniel nodded slowly. That's what I suspected. He opened another document. This is the official timeline Jeff submitted to investors. The log claimed that the core platform was built between 2024 and 2025. But the deeper Daniel looked, the more inconsistencies appeared. Some files contained hidden metadata from earlier development tools. Others referenced outdated frameworks. Daniel leaned back. Someone changed the timestamps, he said quietly. I felt dizzy. You mean they edited the dates? Yes. He looked directly at me. And the original creation dates appeared to be several years older. The room around us buzzed with celebration. But suddenly everything felt quiet. Because if those timestamps were fake, Jeff's entire story might not be true. Daniel's expression turned serious. If your brother used intellectual property that wasn't his, he said, this company could collapse overnight. My chest tightened. Jeff had just raised millions in interest from investors tonight. Exposing something like that could destroy everything. But another thought hurt even more. Jeff had just humiliated me in front of hundreds of people. I tried to calm my thoughts. Maybe it's still a misunderstanding, I said. Daniel considered that possibility. Perhaps, he replied. Then he asked the question that made my stomach twist. Do you still have your original files? For a moment I almost said no. 4 years had passed. I had moved apartments twice since then. Most of my old tech equipment was gone. But then a memory surfaced. Back when I built FlowSync, I used a cloud backup service. I rarely used it anymore, but I never deleted the account. If the files were still there, they would contain the original timestamps from when the system was created. Proof of when FlowSync truly existed. I slowly pulled out my phone. I might still have them, I said quietly. Daniel's eyes widened. Then we should check. My hands trembled as I opened the cloud storage app on my phone. The account hadn't been used in years. For a moment I worried the company might have deleted inactive accounts. But the login screen still appeared. I typed my old password carefully. The loading circle spun for several seconds. Daniel waited silently beside me. The noise of the party continued across the room. Jeff laughed with a group of guests while cameras flashed around him. Finally the storage dashboard appeared. A list of old folders loaded slowly. Most of them were small freelance projects from years ago. I scrolled down nervously. Maybe the FlowSync files were gone. Maybe I had deleted them without remembering. But then one folder appeared near the bottom. FlowSync_prototype_. My heart skipped. I opened the directory. Hundreds of files appeared instantly. Design documents, algorithm modules, routing simulations, every part of the system I built years ago. And next to each file, a creation date. Daniel leaned closer to the screen. Those dates can't be easily changed in cloud storage, he said softly, which meant something important. The system existed long before Jeff claimed he invented it. Daniel carefully reviewed the files on his tablet after I shared access. He opened the earliest documents first. The design notes described the core architecture of FlowSync. Each section explained how delivery routes could adapt in real time based on traffic and supply changes. Daniel's eyebrows slowly lifted. These concepts matched the exact foundation of LaunchFlow AI, he said. He opened another file. This one contained the original algorithm for route optimization. Inside the file metadata, my name appeared as the creator. Daniel scrolled further. Commit history showed how the code evolved over several months. Each update had a timestamp from 2019. I felt a strange mix of pride and sadness looking at the old work. I had poured countless nights into building that system, and then I had walked away from it completely. Daniel finally looked up from the screen. You didn't just contribute to this technology, he said. You built the core of it. The words echoed in my mind. Across the room, Jeff laughed with investors who believed he was the genius behind it all. But now the truth was sitting quietly on a tablet. Daniel closed the files and stared at me for a moment. You realize what this means, he said. I nodded slowly. If these documents are authentic, they prove the technology existed years before your brother's company. He stood up from the table. I need to speak with Jeff privately. My chest tightened. What happens now? I asked. Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked across the room toward Jeff. I watched nervously as they spoke for a moment. Jeff smiled confidently at first. Then Daniel gestured toward a nearby conference room. Jeff looked surprised but followed him inside. The door closed behind them. A strange tension spread through the hall. Some investors noticed the sudden meeting and whispered among themselves. I remained seated, staring at the table. Part of me wanted to leave the party immediately, but another part knew I couldn't walk away now. For years ago I lost the chance to defend my work. Tonight the truth had finally surfaced. And inside that conference room, Jeff was about to face the evidence. 10 minutes later the conference room door opened. Daniel stepped out first. His expression was serious. Jeff followed behind him. But the confidence he had earlier was gone. His face looked pale. Daniel motioned for me to join them inside the room. My legs felt heavy as I walked in. Jeff glanced at me quickly. Then he forced a nervous laugh. Oh, this, he said casually. My brother helped brainstorm some early ideas years ago. Daniel placed the tablet on the table. These files show complete architecture, he said calmly. Not just brainstorming. Jeff shifted in his chair. Well, he shared some concepts with me back then, Jeff continued. I refined them and turned them into a real product. Daniel shook his head. These files predate your company by 4 years. Jeff's smile faded. For a moment the room stayed silent. Then Jeff leaned forward. Look, he said. The project was abandoned. He walked away from it. His voice sounded defensive now. But the foundation still belonged to someone, Daniel replied. Jeff didn't respond. The silence in the room felt heavy. Jeff finally slammed his hand on the table. Yes, I used parts of the project, he snapped. But he abandoned it. I stared at him in shock. You never even asked me, I said quietly. Jeff looked frustrated. You left that laptop at my place and disappeared, he replied. The code was sitting there doing nothing. Daniel raised his hand. That doesn't make it yours, he said firmly. Jeff shook his head. I built the business around it, he argued. I hired developers, raised funding, and turned it into a real company. That may be true, Daniel said. But the core intellectual property came from somewhere else. Jeff leaned back in his chair. You're saying everything I built is worthless? No, Daniel replied calmly. I'm saying the foundation belongs to someone else. The words hung in the air. Jeff glanced at me with anger. But deep down he knew the evidence spoke louder than anything he could say. Daniel stepped outside the conference room and called several other investors. Within minutes, 4 people gathered around the table. They listened carefully as Daniel explained the situation. He showed them the original FlowSync files. He also displayed the development logs Jeff had submitted. The investors compared the timelines silently. One woman leaned forward and whispered, "The architecture is identical." Jeff looked nervous now. "This is being blown out of proportion," he said quickly. "The final product is completely different." But Daniel raised one important point. Even if improvements were made, he said, the original intellectual property must be credited properly. One investor asked a question that made the room even quieter. Why did you introduce him as the sibling who never made it? Jeff hesitated. It was just a joke, he replied. But Daniel shook his head. Character matters when we invest in founders. He looked directly at Jeff. You publicly humiliated the person who may have created the foundation of your company. The investors exchanged serious glances. And for the first time that night, Jeff looked afraid. Daniel folded his arms and spoke calmly to the group. Investors don't only fund technology, he said. We fund people. Everyone listened closely. A founder's character tells us how they will handle success, failure, and partnerships. He gestured toward me. Tonight Jeff introduced his brother as the sibling who never made it. Jeff shifted uncomfortably. But now we are learning that this sibling may have invented the foundation of the entire platform. The room stayed silent. One investor nodded slowly. That says something important about leadership. Jeff tried to defend himself. You don't understand our family situation, he said. But Daniel raised his hand again. Family issues are one thing, he replied. Taking credit for someone else's work is another. Jeff looked down at the table. For the first time since the launch party began, he didn't seem like the confident founder anymore. Instead, he looked like someone realizing the entire night was slipping out of his control. Daniel turned his attention toward me. What would you do with this technology today? He asked. I blinked in surprise. I haven't worked on it in years, I replied. That's not what I asked, he said gently. He slid the tablet back across the table. If you continued developing FlowSync today, what improvements would you make? I hesitated. Coding had been a big part of my life once, but I had stepped away from it. Still, the old ideas came rushing back. I would rebuild the routing engine with adaptive learning, I said slowly. The investors leaned closer. The system could study delivery patterns over time, I continued. Then it could predict supply chain problems before they happen. Jeff stared at me. I kept speaking. Also, the warehouse integration could run in a distributed network to reduce processing delays. Daniel smiled slightly. Jeff suddenly realized something terrifying. The investors were no longer listening to him. They were listening to me. Daniel placed a spare laptop on the table. Would you be willing to demonstrate part of that idea? He asked. I felt nervous. It's been years, I said. That's okay, he replied. Just show us a small example. The investors waited quietly. I opened a blank development environment and began typing. At first my fingers moved slowly, but after a few minutes the familiar rhythm returned. The logic of the routing engine came back to me. I rebuilt a simplified version of the optimization algorithm. 30 minutes later, I ran a simulation. The screen displayed several delivery routes adjusting dynamically based on new warehouse data. Daniel compared the results with Jeff's system. The room went silent. The numbers spoke clearly. My demo improved route efficiency by nearly 40%. One investor leaned back in his chair. "Incredible," he whispered. Jeff looked stunned. And suddenly the balance of power in the room shifted completely. Daniel closed the laptop slowly. Then he looked around the room. "We invested in the wrong founder," he said quietly. Jeff jumped up from his chair. "You can't be serious," he shouted. But the investors were already discussing the numbers they had seen. The improvements from my simple demo were impossible to ignore. One investor spoke calmly. "The original creator clearly understands the technology at a deeper level." Jeff looked furious. "I built the company," he argued. Daniel nodded. "That may be true. But the core innovation came from somewhere else." Jeff turned toward me. "You're trying to steal my business," he yelled. I shook my head. "I never asked for this situation." Daniel raised his voice slightly. "Enough." The room became quiet again. "Tonight was meant to celebrate innovation," he said. "Instead, we discovered the real story behind it." Jeff sat down slowly. For the first time that evening, he looked completely defeated. After a short discussion, the investors made their decision. Daniel spoke clearly. "Given the unresolved intellectual property concerns, we cannot move forward with funding tonight." Jeff stared at him in disbelief. "You're pulling $20 million because of this?" he asked. Daniel nodded. "Yes." Jeff slammed his fist on the table. "This is sabotage," he shouted, pointing at me. I stayed silent. Daniel responded calmly. "No one sabotaged your company." Jeff glared at him. "You're taking his side." Daniel shook his head. "I'm taking the side of truth." The investors gathered their documents. One by one they stood up from the table. Jeff's startup, which had been worth millions only an hour earlier, suddenly had no funding behind it. The celebration outside the conference room continued, but inside everything had changed. Jeff stared at the floor. Daniel spoke one final sentence. "You sabotaged yourself." As the investors prepared to leave, Daniel turned toward me again. "What if we rebuilt the company properly?" he asked. I blinked in surprise. "With full legal protection," he continued, "and with the original creator leading the technology." The room grew quiet. Jeff stared at Daniel like he had just heard the worst news possible. "You're offering him my company?" Jeff asked. Daniel shook his head. "No. I'm offering him the opportunity to build what should have existed in the first place." The other investors looked thoughtful. One of them nodded slowly. "The technology clearly has potential." Daniel looked back at me. "Would you be interested in leading the development if we funded it properly?" My mind spun with possibilities. 4 years ago I had given up on FlowSync completely. Now the same idea stood at the center of a room filled with investors. Everyone waited for my answer. Fast forward 6 months later, a new company launched. This time the technology was fully documented and protected. The system kept the original spirit of FlowSync, but added the improvements we discussed that night. Investors supported the project strongly. News outlets called it a breakthrough in logistics technology. Some articles even mentioned how it grew out of a failed startup from the year before. But the biggest difference was leadership. The new company credited the original architecture correctly. My name appeared on every official document. Developers joined the team to help build the next generation of the platform. And for the first time in years, I returned to the world of coding. The work felt exciting again. Sometimes unexpected opportunities come from the most uncomfortable moments. That launch party was supposed to celebrate someone else's success. Instead, it reopened a door I thought had closed forever. I still remember the ending of the aborted launch day. The room felt different at that time. Just an hour before then, Jeff had been the center of everything. Cameras followed him. Investors laughed at his jokes. People treated him like the next tech genius. Then moments later he stood alone. The contracts were gone. The funding was gone. The company he had just celebrated minutes earlier was already collapsing in front of him. Jeff looked at me like he couldn't believe what had happened. You ruined everything, he had said quietly. His voice sounded smaller than I had ever heard it. Across the table, Daniel closed his laptop and looked directly at him. No, he said calmly. You did that yourself. Jeff opened his mouth, but no words came out. The investors were already standing, gathering their things, whispering to each other about legal reviews and intellectual property audits. For them, the decision was already made. Launchflow AI was finished. Jeff turned back to me. His expression shifted from anger to something else. Desperation. You can't do this, he said under his breath. This company is my dream. I looked at him for a long moment. You already took my dream once, I said quietly. He didn't answer, because deep down he knew it was true. The room slowly emptied, but Daniel didn't leave. Instead, he leaned back in his chair and looked at me carefully. You know something interesting, he said. What? I asked. He folded his hands. When I first invested in Jeff, I thought I was backing a brilliant founder. He nodded toward the laptop still showing my old files. Turns out I was backing the wrong sibling. I didn't know what to say. Coding had been a closed chapter in my life for years. I'm not looking to restart anything, I said. Daniel smiled slightly. That's the thing. He slid a new document across the table. I am. I frowned. What do you mean? He tapped the document. A new company. Built properly. With the real creator leading the technology this time. The number at the bottom of the proposal made my breath catch. $20 million. The same investment Jeff had just lost. Daniel studied my reaction. Well, he asked. The room went quiet. Jeff stared at me like the answer would decide his fate. I should have felt angry. I should have felt victorious. But strangely, I just felt tired. 4 years ago I had walked away from tech because betrayal had burned me out completely. Part of me wanted to walk away again. But then I remembered something. The moment Jeff stood on stage and called me, the sibling who never made it. The laughter. The stares. The humiliation. That moment had brought the truth into the open. If he hadn't tried to embarrass me, none of this would have happened. I looked at Daniel, then at Jeff, then back at the screen showing the code I had written years ago. And finally I nodded. I'll do it, I said. Jeff's shoulders dropped. But Daniel didn't smile. Instead he said something unexpected. There's just one more thing you should know. I frowned. What? Daniel leaned forward slightly. The investors didn't discover your files tonight. My stomach tightened. What do you mean? He tapped the laptop screen again. I found FlowSync 3 weeks ago. The words hit me like a shock. What? He nodded calmly. When Jeff first pitched Launchflow AI, something about the architecture looked familiar. So I started digging. My heart started racing. And I found your abandoned repository. Jeff slowly turned toward Daniel. You knew, he whispered. Daniel nodded. Yes. The room went silent. Jeff looked stunned. You knew this whole time, he said. Daniel shrugged slightly. I suspected. Then he looked directly at me. But I needed proof of something else. I felt a strange chill run down my spine. Proof of what? Daniel leaned back in his chair. Character. Jeff blinked in confusion. Daniel gestured toward the stage where Jeff had humiliated me earlier. When your brother introduced you tonight, I wanted to see how both of you would react. Jeff stared at him. You set this up? Daniel didn't deny it. I wanted to know whether the real creator still had the vision to lead this technology. My mind spun. Wait, I said slowly. So the question you asked me earlier was the test, Daniel finished. The room felt suddenly unreal. Jeff sank into a chair, completely stunned. You destroyed my company for a test? He asked. Daniel shook his head. No. He looked Jeff straight in the eye. You destroyed it the moment you stole someone else's work. Jeff had no reply. Daniel stood up and extended his hand toward me. So, he said, are you ready to build the future the way it was meant to be built? I looked around the quiet room. Just a few hours earlier, I had been the sibling who never made it. Now the same investors who laughed at Jeff's joke were preparing to fund my company instead. Life has a strange sense of timing. Sometimes the moment meant to humiliate you is actually the moment that introduces you to the room that changes everything. And the strangest part? Jeff was the one who put me on that stage. He just didn't realize it yet. But the real twist didn't come until months later. When the press covered the launch of our new company, the headlines didn't say, "Former startup founder loses investment." They said something much worse. They said, "Investor discovers real creator of revolutionary logistics AI," after founder publicly insults her on stage. Jeff's name appeared in every article, but not as the genius, as the cautionary story. And every time someone reads that headline, they remember the same lesson. Never humiliate the quiet person in the room, because sometimes they're the one who built the entire future.